They went to sleep as Danes, and woke up as Germans. During World War II, the German army took Denmark in just 4 hours, turning ordinary Danish civilians into subjects of the Reich overnight. The German military fought with planes, tanks, and armored vehicles, while Denmark went to war on bicycles. Yet no one expected that this bicycle unit, whose 100 kilometers of fuel cost little more than a couple of bread rolls, would eventually earn the respect of every German soldier they faced. On the morning of April 9, 1940, the flames of World War II were spreading northward from the Western Front into Northern Europe. At this time, Europe was still in the so-called phony war period, and after successfully annexing Poland, Nazi Germany turned its gaze toward the Scandinavian peninsula. To secure control over the transportation routes of Swedish iron ore, Germany devised a military plan codenamed Operation Weserübung, aiming to invade Denmark and Norway simultaneously. For Denmark, the arrival of this war was wrapped in contradiction and the illusion of peace. Less than a year before the invasion, in May 1939, Denmark had just signed a non-aggression pact with Germany. Denmark naively believed this piece of paper would serve as a shield, and thus adhered strictly to neutrality and appeasement. Even as German forces massed in large numbers along the border, Denmark's leadership still chose to keep the peace, rejecting frontline commanders' requests to strengthen border defenses. Fearing that any aggressive military movement would become an excuse for invasion, this ostrich-like diplomatic strategy planted the seeds for Denmark's rapid collapse. On screen, a group of Danish soldiers are carrying out their uniquely unconventional military training. Shooting practice is merely a warm-up, because their signature skill is bicycle repair. Under the watchful eye of an officer's stopwatch, one soldier expertly removes the front wheel, strips off the tire, pulls out the inner tube, quickly finds the leak, applies glue, then smoothly reassembles and inflates it, completing the entire process in just 2 minutes and setting a new record for the Danish army. Lieutenant Sand, a young officer with a sterner expression and sharper gaze, is clearly not satisfied. He raises the difficulty, demanding the same task be completed within 90 seconds. Those vanishing 30 seconds, like the war about to arrive, instantly shatter the soldiers' calm rhythm, throwing them into chaos and frustration. During training breaks, the soldiers enjoy coffee and food, as if war were merely a distant term spoken by politicians. Lieutenant Germansen even optimistically analyzes that Germany's real target is the more strategically valuable Norway, and that Denmark is merely passing terrain, nothing to worry about. However, an urgent order soon shatters this pastoral illusion completely. A messenger roars in on a motorcycle, delivering a command that is brief and forceful. All units are ordered to immediately stop training and return to barracks. The atmosphere upon returning grows suddenly heavy. The soldiers are instructed to collect issued supplies, each receiving exactly 40 rounds of ammunition and 1 medical kit. An even more unusual order follows. They are required to sleep in full combat gear. To avoid panic, officers claim this is merely a high-level exercise, but the soldiers are not fools. Everyone knows this is no drill, but the eve of war, and the last, most hurried preparation. Meanwhile, inside headquarters, a lieutenant colonel anxiously conducts final communications with higher command. News arrives from border checkpoint No. 3. A large German force has assembled on the opposite side of the border, fully mobilized and awaiting orders. Burning with urgency, the lieutenant colonel requests immediate deployment toward the border to establish a forward defense line, at least to show resistance. His request is coldly denied. The prime minister in Copenhagen believes that any proactive military confrontation could escalate the situation and hand Germany a pretext. The highest order is clear. All units are to remain in place and take no independent action. Facing this helpless command, the lieutenant colonel can only order maximum alertness and readiness for combat before dismissing the meeting. Political appeasement and military passivity have already written Denmark's fate for the following day. In the soldiers' barracks, fear and pressure on the eve of war ignite human conflict. Soldier Anderson, a young man with excellent marksmanship but a volatile temper, approaches Lassen, whose shooting scores are poor, and attempts to forcibly take his ammunition under the excuse of efficient resource allocation. He believes bullets should belong to those who know how to use them best. Under pressure, the timid Lassen has no choice but to comply. At that moment, barracks leader Graham steps in to stop it. Calm and resolute, Graham states that 40 rounds per person is regulation, and no one has the right to take more. Anderson's anger flares, and he launches a personal attack, mocking Graham for not wanting to win. Because his father is German, the words strike Graham deeply. His face flushes red as he shouts back that although he has German blood, he was born in Denmark, raised in Denmark, and is 100% Danish. As a fight is about to break out, Lieutenant Sand arrives on patrol and shuts it down with authority. The soldiers grudgingly return to their beds, but whatever little sleep remained in the barracks is gone. At 4 a.m. on April 9, 1940, the clock of history tolls a death knell for Denmark. The German steel tide officially crosses the border, launching a lightning assault under the name Operation Weserübung. After its final report, Border Checkpoint No. 3 goes completely silent. A piercing alarm tore through the quiet of the barracks, jolting soldiers awake from nightmares as they hurriedly donned their gear and assembled outside with tense faces. The lieutenant found Bandegrad, the sergeant of the motorcycle unit, and relayed the order from higher command. Their mission was to support the motorcycle unit and, at all costs, delay the German forces advancing north until reinforcements arrived. Under the cover of pitch-black night, this peculiar bicycle unit began its tragic march toward the border. Wheels rolled over silent country roads, and every soldier carried a heavy weight in his heart. They all knew that their equipment and training were worlds apart from the enemy they were about to face, but behind them lay their homeland, and aside from standing their ground, they had no other choice. After marching through the night, dawn began to break, and distant gunfire tightened every nerve. Soon, they spotted the battered figures of their motorcycle unit, retreating in disarray. The motorcycle sergeant reported the grim situation to the lieutenant. The German army had armored vehicles and motorized infantry, with overwhelming firepower and mobility, and although the Danish forces had briefly engaged them, the result was total inferiority. Given this reality, the sergeant decided to lead the motorcycle unit to withdraw and establish a new defensive position in a northern town. He urged the lieutenant and the bicycle unit to retreat together and preserve their strength. The lieutenant stubbornly refused. Orders were absolute, and his mission was to hold this position until reinforcements arrived. He decided that since the forward position had fallen, they would set up an ambush right here, on this road. After failing to persuade him, the sergeant led the motorcycle unit away in resignation. The lieutenant quickly arranged his tactics, splitting the platoon into 3 groups, one in the forest on the left, one in the ditch on the right, and the machine gun team occupying a sloped high ground beside the road. His plan was simple, even naive, believing that if they could hold for 20 minutes, reinforcements would arrive. The platoon's only hope, an aging Madsen light machine gun, was tasked with destroying German armored vehicles. The soldiers began their defensive preparations under intense pressure, and without the fire support of the motorcycle unit, the difficulty of this ambush rose exponentially. In suffocating silence, the roar of German engines grew louder, and black steel beasts slowly entered their view. When they rolled into range, the lieutenant gave the order, and the ambush erupted. At the start of the battle, the Danish soldiers achieved some success through surprise, but once the Germans reacted and entered full combat mode, the situation reversed instantly. The machine gunner Anderson, the same soldier who had demanded extra bullets in the barracks, now proved his shooting skill with action. His machine gun fire successfully ignited the fuel tank of a German armored vehicle, but the joy of victory vanished in an instant. Comrades beside him fell one after another, and more bullets struck other German vehicles, only to spark harmlessly off their armor. German firepower was fierce and precise, and the Danish defensive line was rapidly torn apart. Seeing casualties mount and enemy fire impossible to suppress, the lieutenant decisively ordered a retreat. Several soldiers managed to escape the battlefield, but lost contact with their commanding officer. Lieutenant Sand led the remaining few soldiers, like startled birds, into a remote farmhouse. Their sudden intrusion terrified the elderly couple inside. Fortunately, Lieutenant Sand quickly identified himself and did his best to calm them. This modest farmhouse became a brief and warm shelter amid the battlefield. The soldiers were still shaken, the recent fight like a nightmare they could not wake from. Fear, exhaustion, and despair hung over everyone. After a short rest, Lieutenant Sand decided to lead the group toward the command center where the colonel was stationed. Before leaving, he expressed sincere gratitude to the elderly couple. The old woman urged them to stay and hide there, saying she did not want to see these young men die for nothing, and she spoke a line that lingered deeply. She said that 20 years ago this place belonged to Germany, and now it belongs to Denmark again, and she did not care who occupied it. Her words encapsulated the film's core conflict. They represented the most simple desire of ordinary people under the constant pull of history: peace and survival. For people like her, a sense of belonging is far less tangible than a stable and peaceful life. This stood in stark contrast to Lieutenant Sand's unwavering patriotism, and he immediately spoke up in rebuttal. This exchange had no right or wrong, only different positions, and it deeply revealed the dual nature of war. For soldiers, it is a sacred duty to defend their homeland. For some civilians, it is nothing more than a senseless disaster that disrupts their peaceful lives. Through this small detail, the film expands the dimensions of war, making it no longer a simple matter of black and white. Leaving the house behind, the group set out once more. After a grueling journey, the squad finally reached the rear command center. Lieutenant Sand immediately reported the situation to the colonel, guessing that the lieutenant had been captured, and that the survivors he led were the last remaining spark from the ambush. He believed they had not been completely defeated and requested new combat orders. The colonel pulled Lieutenant Sand aside and delivered even more devastating news through fragmented channels. He had learned that for strategic reasons, the High Command had already decided to abandon the border region, and the planned reinforcements would never arrive. Worse still, Denmark's border defenses had completely collapsed. With nearly all units retreating northward in disarray, the German army had cut all Danish telephone lines. Now, units could no longer communicate effectively, and each had become an isolated island. Faced with this situation, the colonel made a final decision to gather every available unit and move toward the city of Haderslev to link up with local forces. There, they would attempt to establish a new defensive line and make a last stand. After receiving the order, Lieutenant Sand quickly led his bicycle unit back on the move. They chose a rarely used back road, hoping to reach Haderslev faster than the German forces advancing along the main highway. Midway through the journey, Soldier Lassen's bicycle suffered an untimely flat tire. During a life-or-death retreat, this was a crushing setback. Lieutenant Sand had no choice but to order a halt and instructed Anderson, who had previously clashed with Lassen in the barracks, to help with the repair. While waiting, the lieutenant approached a soldier who was deeply shaken by the death of a close friend. He did not offer empty words of comfort, but simply placed a hand on the soldier's shoulder and said in a low, steady voice, "Remember, you are a member of 2nd Platoon, 4th Company Bicycle Unit. You are never alone." At a moment when morale was collapsing and the future uncertain, these words carried immense weight. He tried to hold together a unit on the brink of breaking by appealing to collective honor. The bicycle unit reached a small town outside Haderslev and discovered that the motorcycle unit that had retreated earlier had already built a crude defensive line there. However, the scene in town left them confused and unsettled. Large numbers of local civilians gathered along the road as if watching a spectacle. They pointed at the fully armed soldiers, showing no visible fear of the war on their faces. One innocent young boy even wove through the crowd, trying to sell milk to the soldiers. At that moment, Lieutenant Sand noticed a leaflet dropped by a German aircraft lying on the ground, printed in German and a form of Danish mixed with Norwegian terms. It demanded that Denmark abandon resistance, claiming the German army had come to protect them from British and French aggression. This clumsy propaganda filled the lieutenant with disgust and anger. Just then, the German vanguard reached the outskirts of the town, and the Danish forces immediately began evacuating civilians and preparing to fight. Despite the added fire support from the motorcycle unit, Danish resistance remained painfully fragile in the face of German armored vehicles. During the exchange of fire, the little boy who had been selling milk moments earlier was tragically struck by a stray bullet and collapsed in a pool of blood. His mother's heart-wrenching cries rang out, only to be instantly swallowed by the thunder of artillery. Facing German armored vehicles, the Danish army was still powerless. Once again, confronted by an overwhelming disparity in strength, the lieutenant helplessly issued the order to retreat. They were fortunate enough to find a truck and fled the town in disarray. Inside the truck bed, the soldiers' morale sank to its lowest point. They had fought and retreated, yet never once experienced a battle fought on equal terms. This sense of helplessness was even more suffocating than death itself. In silence, they distributed their remaining ammunition, preparing for the next battle, which might also be the last. When Lieutenant Sand's unit arrived in the city of Haderslev, they were met with an atmosphere of calm and normalcy. People on the streets went about their daily lives, as if the smoke of war had never reached this place. At the city's defensive line, they were stopped by local guards, whose commander refused them entry on the grounds that he had received no orders. Continuous fighting and retreat had completely worn down Lieutenant Sand's patience. He confronted the opposing officer and demanded, "You haven't been in combat yet, have you? While we were waiting for your support, soldiers were already dying on the border. Let us in." Perhaps shaken by the bloodshot eyes and grief in the lieutenant's words, the guard commander finally chose to let them pass. After entering the city, Lieutenant Sand reported to the highest local commander, Colonel Hartz. The colonel apologized for failing to send reinforcements, then assigned them a city block to defend. At the lieutenant's request, the colonel agreed to provide them with urgently needed ammunition. Before long, the sound of gunfire and artillery came from outside the city. The German army had reached the outskirts. Lieutenant Sand immediately led his unit toward their designated position. Along the way, confused civilians even approached to ask what was happening. The lieutenant could only urge them to find shelter somewhere safe. After reaching the block, he quickly carried out tactical deployment. Using buildings and obstacles, they constructed defensive positions for street fighting. After a stretch of suffocating silence, German infantry finally appeared at the end of the street. As Danish soldiers pulled their triggers, the street battle of Haderslev officially began. In the early stage of the fight, Danish forces used the terrain and surprise to trade blows with the enemy, but this balance was quickly broken when German armored vehicles entered the streets. Facing these steel monsters that were impossible to stop even in open ground, the Danish soldiers were completely helpless in the narrow streets. Their rifle bullets struck the armor and only sparked weak flashes of light. The armored vehicles charged like raging beasts, tearing apart the Danish defensive line at will. The soldiers could only retreat while firing back, and the lieutenant tried every method he could, attempting to delay the enemy with bundled grenades, but with little effect. Before long, Soldier Justisen was struck by enemy fire and collapsed. His comrades dragged him behind cover under heavy fire and attempted to treat his wounds, but his injuries were too severe, and aside from basic bandaging to stop the bleeding, there was nothing they could do amid the chaos of battle. Justisen's life slowly slipped away as his comrades watched in helpless silence. The fighting continued. Ammunition was nearly exhausted, and the German army kept advancing steadily. The surviving soldiers gathered around Lieutenant Sand, looking at him with anxious and desperate eyes, waiting for the next order. At this moment, Lieutenant Sand was trapped in unprecedented anguish and inner conflict. If they continued fighting, they had no ammunition left and faced an unbeatable enemy, and the result would only be more pointless losses. To surrender, as a soldier, was the greatest humiliation, but looking at the young, terrified faces around him, he knew that preserving their lives was his final responsibility as a commander. In the end, humanity overcame duty. With the surrender of Lieutenant Sand and his men, the battle for Haderslev came to an end. Regrettably, they were ultimately unable to save Justisen's life. The disarmed Danish soldiers sat slumped against the wall, waiting for the victors to decide their fate. They had fought, and they had lost, completely and utterly. A German officer approached Lieutenant Sand, with Graham acting as interpreter at his side. The officer showed no arrogance of victory, but instead asked a question with visible confusion. "Why have you kept fighting against us all this time? This battle is completely unnecessary and has only wasted so many innocent lives." The question stunned the lieutenant, since defending one's homeland, in his mind, needed no justification. Seeing the lieutenant's puzzled expression, the German officer explained his reason, and this reason became the final straw that crushed the Danish soldiers' psychological defenses. He said that your government had announced surrender long ago. Did you not know? Hearing this, Lieutenant Sand felt as if struck by lightning and stood frozen in place, with all communications completely cut by the Germans. These soldiers fighting and bleeding on the front lines had no idea that their country had already given up resistance. All their sacrifices, all their perseverance, had become an unseen and meaningless solo performance. In the film's final scene, the captured Danish soldiers are loaded onto buses, their faces inside filled with confusion and pain. Outside the windows, the people of Haderslev warmly interact with the German soldiers entering the city, and children even joyfully climb onto German tanks. Just as the farm woman said, for some people on this land, who rules it may truly not matter that much. And with that, the film ends. Watching this film feels like staring at a piece of amber worn smooth by the tides of history. What it encases is not epic heroism, but an almost suffocating sense of powerlessness and existential absurdity. It does not question the cruelty of war, because that is already well known. What truly pierces the viewer's heart is a far sharper blade. When your sacrifice, your faith, and everything you have bled for are revealed to have been meaningless from the very beginning, how do you go on living? This is the central question that lingered in my mind long after the film ended. What shocked me most was not the disparity in equipment between Danish soldiers and German forces, but the rupture of purpose. From the moment Lieutenant Sand led the bicycle platoon onto the road, They lived inside a reality constructed by information. They believed they were the first line of defense for their homeland, that reinforcements were on the way, and that their stand was buying time for the nation. This purpose was the sole spiritual pillar that carried them forward through fear and artillery fire. In the first half of the film, all struggle, combat, and sacrifice are built upon this solid foundation. They meticulously repaired their bicycles, as if they were the ultimate weapon against the steel tide. They stubbornly set ambushes on the road, firmly believing that 20 minutes of resistance could bring a turning point. Within their own frame of understanding, every action was filled with tragic heroism, yet the film's structure is a carefully designed deception. It immerses both the audience and the soldiers in this sense of heroism until the final moment. Then, through the calm voice of a German officer, it reveals a truth powerful enough to destroy everything. Your government surrendered hours ago. This sentence carries more destructive force than any artillery shell. It does not strike the body, but directly detonates the foundation of the soldier's inner world. In an instant, all bravery turns into reckless foolishness. All sacrifice becomes worthless loss. The warm blood of fallen comrades seems to lose its weight. This is a form of spiritual dismemberment far more cruel than dying on the battlefield. Through this, I saw courage revealed in different dimensions. In the first half, Lieutenant Sand's courage is the traditional courage of a soldier, obeying orders, leading from the front, and rallying morale in desperate situations. But at the end of the street battle in Hadersleff, when ammunition is gone, casualties are heavy, and victory is impossible, he makes a far harder choice: surrender, when he shouts that it is over and throws down his helmet. This is not cowardice, but a deeper form of courage. It is the courage to face meaninglessness head-on and choose to preserve life. Continuing to fight at that moment would only satisfy an illusion of military honor, using his soldiers' lives as tribute to a cause that had already failed. By choosing surrender, he bears the deepest shame a soldier can carry, but saves countless families from loss. This decision requires more inner strength than any charge into gunfire. The film's portrayal of civilians is equally thought-provoking, whether it is the old woman who says she does not care who occupies the land, the townspeople watching the fighting and selling milk on the edge of danger, or the children cheering atop German tanks at the end. The director passes no moral judgment. Instead, he calmly presents a reality for ordinary people far removed from the center of political power. Grand narratives often matter less than a stable life in the present. The soldiers fight and bleed on an ideological island, defending their homeland, yet the people they swear to protect may quickly adapt to a new order with near indifference. This sharp sense of disconnection deepens the tragedy and loneliness of these soldiers. Their struggle is not understood by the enemy, nor truly shared by their own people. History is written by the victors, and in its grand chapters, there is rarely room for a defeated bicycle platoon. But this film exists as a mournful poem written as a footnote to that forgotten history. It tells us that beneath sweeping historical narratives lie countless crushed wills and broken emotions. Remembering them and understanding their struggle may not change history's course, but it can deepen our understanding of war and of human existence. That's all for today. I'm a film lover, and I look forward to meeting you again next time.